At this time of year, everything starts growing. The oilseed rape behind me is in flower, just starting to flower, and people think that you need to go and put on lots of nitrogen on their soil to make their plants grow even bigger and better. Now, obviously, farmers have to do that at the moment every year because they're taking off crops intensively and they want to keep the growth. And they will add on maybe a general purpose fertiliser. But in the garden, do you really need to do that? Because all this nitrogen that we put onto the crops every year, a huge amount of the fertiliser just ends up in the streams and rivers, polluting it like mad. And in the garden, we are not taking off intensive crops, and we can look after the soil in the way that perhaps large-scale farmers can't do. Up to now, it was always perceived wisdom that every year you put on a general purpose fertiliser, and that was something like 10, 10, 10. And that refers to the ratio of nitrogen, phosphate and potassium, NPK, which the plant needs. But Robert Pavlis, who's a Canadian horticulturist, went through the scientific evidence and discovered that actually plants don't use 10, 10, 10 ratio, that this general purpose was just a number that somebody conjured up. What they actually use is more like 3, 1, 2. So a bit of nitrogen, tiny bit of phosphate and a little bit more of potassium. So if we're going to go down the aisles in the supermarkets and pick up a shelf of this general purpose, most of the 10, 10, 10 is actually going to end up in the streams and not do the plants any good. I haven't used artificial fertilisers on my garden, on my borders, on my vegetable for years and years. And I was surprised when I was on a panel of gardeners question time and somebody asked that question, and none of the other panel members next to me either had ever used any artificial fertiliser in the recent years. So what are we doing that actually makes plants grow? If you look at the woodland soil, and everyone thinks that woodland soil is perhaps very rich, lovely, thick, dark brown, full of goodness and humus, how does it stay like that? Because no one's feeding the soil, no one's mulching it. But actually, if you look at a mature oak tree, it will be sending down something like 37,000 fragments of leaf, twig, buds, wood a year. So that is nature's mulch. And that is supplying everything that that plant needs in conjunction with the soil mycorrhiza. And so you don't actually feed a woodland, and you don't actually need to feed a border or your vegetables if you put on that mulch instead. And that will be a homemade compost or compost that you bought in. It won't be a bagged compost such as you buy from a garden centre or something like that. The other problem with adding on artificial fertilisers is actually that they change the whole composition of the microorganisms in the soil. It is a very complex system that goes on there. In a tablespoon of soil, there's something like 50 million different microorganisms, and we probably know maybe there'd be 40,000 different species, and we probably only know 10% of what they are. So there's a lot that goes on there that we don't know about, but we do know that when you add on artificial fertiliser, it changes that balance, which is probably not to the good, because the microbes in the soil help supply the trees and the plants with the goodness that they need. So I'm going to show you what I do to my soils to keep them really healthy and to give me wonderful crops without resorting to artificial fertilisers. So what is it that most plants need? Well, we said it's an NPK ratio, something like 3 to 1 to 2. But nitrogen is the big thing that can limit growth. But luckily enough, there's a thing called the nitrogen cycle. And with that, actually nitrogen is released into the soil for plants to use in the form of ammonium in the warmer months. And that's something that's happening all the time. And it is actually quite a large amount of ammonium. It's something like 60 to 80 pounds per annum per acre. So that's a fair amount. So really, we don't have to bother very much about the P and the K because they will be released anyway in those small quantities if you add things like mulch. I mean, I'm standing on my pile. I've got this pile of ramial here, and this is basically finely chopped, shredded bark and tree parts. They're sort of 60, 70 millimetres piece size and down. And they've been in this pile for maybe a year now, but I usually leave them for about 3 months before I use them, because lots of tree bark and bits has tannin in it, and that can produce tannic acid, which can be harmful to growth. So I leave them in a pile and then I whop them on the borders. And the other pile I've got over here is digestate. And this is something I love. There's a nice spade full of this. And this is basically formed, it's a byproduct of plants where they put in lots of organic matter, things like waste crops and things like that. They then break down and they produce gas, which goes to the national grid. And this is this wonderful byproduct. And it's very simple, similar to homegrown compost. And it's got a pretty useful formula, something quite similar in NPK terms to what we use, what a plant uses most, the 3:1:2 ratio. It also importantly adds a lot of organic matter and a lot of microbes to the soil, so it helps feed the soil so they can build up their microbe population. So I tend to mulch my beds every year, either with a homemade compost. I make my own on my compost heaps, but not very efficiently, or I use the ramial, or I use the digestate, or I use the green compost, which local authorities make huge amounts of it in big heaps from all household waste that's organic, and then you can buy that in the trailer load really inexpensively. Or I use spent mushroom compost, but now all the mushroom farms have been turned to housing around here, so that's quite expensive for me to buy. Basically, I buy the cheapest source of bulk organic matter I can. Now, can you overdo it? People often ask. And so I will put about a 50 millimetre layer on my beds every year, on my veg, on my borders, anywhere that I need it. I do know of a rose grower who used to put on lots every year on his fields of roses, and they did find that they got too much potash. So the K element, the potassium, built up because this stuff is fairly high in K. And they started to get really bad growth patterns and they couldn't figure out why. They got the soil tested and they found out that was the problem. But I think they probably overdid it. So just watch your crops, just see that they look healthy, and 50 millimetres a year should be, like 2 inches, should be perfect for most soils. My soil is very thin, it's very fine, there's not much clay in it, so it tends to just disappear. You put it on and 4 or 5 months later you wouldn't know you'd added anything, it's just broken down. Now some people used to think that if you put on wood chips like this, that it would take the nitrogen out of the soil as you break it down. But they found out now, as long as you put it on the top and you don't dig it in, you are not depleting the soil of nitrogen, so you needn't worry about that. You could put on grass clippings, you could put on anything you like. So that's nice to know. You don't have to dig it in. It's very easy work. It's quite nice work. I just do it whenever I've got a piece of space in the border, I've got some free time, and I find it works really, really well. Now, people always worry about soil testing, and when I talk to professional horticulturists with their own gardens, and you say to them, have you ever had your soil tested? They say, nah. And the reason is, I think the home tests you buy are actually pretty rubbish. They're not done correctly, they're not done accurately enough, and so they don't really give you any idea. If you look, people often say if you look on the internet and if the plant's leaves have sort of got yellow flashes, it means this, and chlorosis is a sign of this. But actually those are really not an accurate test. You cannot look at a plant and think, my God, that's got magnesium deficiency or whatever. So if you want to, if you really think you've got a problem and you really think it's necessary, then you can get it tested. And you need to send it away to a proper lab, such as the Wood lab. And in doing that, you need to sample the soil correctly. So when you're taking a soil sample, you want to scrape off the mulch, and then you want to take a sample from the top 150 mil or 6 inches of the soil, and you want to take it from 6 to 10 different places in the garden. Put them in a bucket, mix them all up, and then take about 300 grams worth and send it off to somewhere like Kwood, which is a professional soil lab, or the RHS, if you're a member, they will do one for you too. You send it off to them and they'll give you back a reading and how you should redress the balance. Bear in mind, they will not test for nitrogen. Nitrogen is so unstable, it's leached through so quickly that you could take a sample and have it monitored one day, have it read and tested, and then you'd have heavy rainfall and it would be totally different reading the next day. But don't forget, you've got the nitrogen cycle working away, slowly releasing from the organic matter that you've added lots of nitrogen into the soil, quite enough for plant growth anyway. Now, I think the reason that people love nitrogen is you put it on the lawn or you put it on a plant and instantly you see this massive green growth. But don't forget, when you do that, you're artificially changing the natural microorganism content in the soil. You're altering the populations, and that might not be too good. We don't really know yet. And also that green growth isn't sustainable. The nitrogen will quickly be gone and then the plant will be back to normal. And the other thing is, I think with vegetables, when you grow them slightly slower, without these mass injections of nitrogen, I think they taste a lot better. Well, if you do any taste trials and you taste artificially fed ones compared to slower grown, they do taste much, much better without the added fertiliser. And if you test the Brix level, that's the sugar level in the plant, they will be better too. So you will get much higher ones in plants that are grown slower because they haven't had so much water and fertiliser, and they will taste, I think, far better. There's lots of additives that people have always said you should add to your garden, and one in the UK is blood, fish and bone. And this is meant to be a lovely slow release fertiliser that gives the plant everything it needs. But don't forget, it's not the plant we're feeding, it's the soil really. So the blood is meant to give the nitrogen, which it does do. I had a client who had a huge sausage plant, made millions of sausages a year, and he used to get the blood from his slaughterhouses and spray it on his lawn. And his lawn was the greenest lawn I've ever seen. But don't forget, blood is released very fast, the nitrogen comes out and goes through the soil, and so you're not going to keep it for long. So the blood part is not, the nitrogen part is not slow released. And then you get the fish, which is meant to give the potassium. Now, if it's fish emulsion, this is actually very fast released, and so it's not slow release at all. If it's fish meal, then it is a bit slower, so you are getting a bit of potassium. And then the phosphate in the bone is there. But as we said before, not many soils are deficient in phosphate. And if your soil is above pH 7, then you are not going to get this bone meal to work. It will not release any phosphate. It is locked up. My soil is pH 8, so if I put on bone meal here, it would do absolutely nothing. And the amount it's applied in is something like 556, which is not what the plant needs it in anyway. So I think these are actually very expensive, albeit byproducts, to fertilise your garden with. And I don't think it would do my garden, particularly because it's limey, any good at all, apart from a quick hit of nitrogen, which I don't particularly want. Epsom salts, magnesium sulfate, is another thing that people say is needed. But really, again, not many soils are short of magnesium. And the sulfate, well, sulfate is an important ingredient in the soil. You have the N, the P and the K, and then the sulfate's the next most important element. But that, if you add organic mulches, that has a fair bit of sulfate in it anyway. So that makes me think I really don't need the sulfate. So again, it's most unlikely that you've got a magnesium deficiency. If you had a test and you did have, then maybe you put some magnesium on. But I really think magnesium sulfate is better left to relax and soak in a nice hot bath. Mycorrhizas, another thing that's come into the vogue in the last 10 to 15 years. But really, when you see research done in this, it's quite interesting, particularly in the States. They seem to say that something like 40% of the things that should be in the mycorrhiza actually aren't in there at all. Quite a few of them are dead. And then when Professor Trude Winkleman, who works at Hanover University, she says from what she's basically looked into, some of the tests with mycorrhiza are beneficial, some are actually negative. And so it's a very expensive way of putting something onto your soil which you might not need anyway, and it might not be doing good, it might be doing quite the reverse. So be wary of that one. And biochar is another thing which people are getting into and thinking should we use. And the thing with biochar, well, the problem is there's no industry standard for biochar, and biochar is basically similar to charcoal. It's heated up, wood is heated up, and it produces this biochar. But as there's no industry standard, you don't know what particle size and everything you should get, what is best. And the thought with biochar is it does actually add carbon into the soil. It has got lots of layers within it at a microscopic level, so it has a negative charge, so it can hold on to onto organisms like fungi and bacteria much better, can keep them there, and minerals and things like that. So potentially it's providing a slow release form of feed. But if you've got a healthy soil with lots of microorganisms in it anyway and lots of humus, then maybe you don't need it. And that is the thought, that A, it's expensive, B, if you've got a reasonably good soil, it's probably not doing anything beneficial. But if perhaps you have a very degraded soil or a soil very low in humus and things, then maybe it is good. But you've got to be careful which biochar you use, because they are all very different with very different properties. And once you put it in there, you can't get the stuff out. So I'm not into using that. My soil's had lots of organic matter on it over 30 years. I don't think it would make any difference to it at all. Now, there are some places where you might want to add artificial fertiliser, such as potted plants or plants in the greenhouse. Now, as you can see, it's March. I've got lots of seedlings going on. I've got lots of cuttings that I've taken through the winter. I've got my warm box at the back where I've got my peppers and my chilies and all my more cucumbers, tender stuff going on in a slightly warmer environment. And most of these have gone into compost, a bought compost, which has some fertiliser in it. So that will keep them going for, I think it's something like 3 to 6 months or whatever. Now, certain plants like this, which is a citrus, which looks very, very pale green. There's obviously a nitrogen shortage going on there. Now, I have actually just put some cow muck on there, which I got from the field, a bit haphazard, but I think that will probably make it green up a bit. There's a fair bit of nitrogen in there, and it won't be a massive hit. So when I am growing plants, like my tomatoes will go into this bed in a month or so's time, I'll add more soil into there, and I'll watch them. And if they start to look pale green and they don't go that lovely sort of deep green when it's growing really healthy, I will probably put on some artificial fertiliser into that bed. I'm aware that if you grow tomatoes in the same soil every year in a greenhouse, they will lose condition year by year as they will pull the nutrients out of it. So I will change that soil every so often as well. So for potted plants that are in pots with bases, my pots in the ground I never fertilise. Those are my pots where I've cut off the bases and their roots are basically in the ground. I would never fertilise those. But for pots such as my citrus and my more tender stuff, my plumbagos, I will actually add some fertiliser to the pots. So that's the one occasion where I do put some artificial on, or I get some cow muck or something from the field. And that just gives them what they need, tickles them up, and they get growing away. So my vegetable bed, the asparagus is about to come through. So I'm just going to put some of this lovely digestate on it. And I'll do it about 50 ml thick. It will keep the weeds down. And it will feed the soil, and that will feed the plants. So it's a win-win situation. It's cost next to nothing. It looks beautiful, it smells beautiful, and it does a good job in helping with the maintenance. So I find it a really fabulous thing to put on my beds. Come and have a look at my compost heaps. So these are my compost heaps. I've got 2 of them here and I've got some more down in the bottom. Now I'm not very proud of them. I don't take my compost very seriously. I do tend to chop up the big woody stuff with the secateurs, so it's sort of nice small, like anything bigger than this would go into my wood pile actually. But so I do chop it up, but I used to feel guilty because I never turn it, or rarely turn it. I just don't have time nowadays. And then I read some research which said that they measured the temperature and everything from the compost over a year of heaps that were turned and not turned. And on a domestic scale, so I'm not including the huge local authority tips where they are turned obviously regularly and they get high temperatures and all the weeds are killed. But domestically, apparently it makes no difference after a year whether you turn it or not. So that's not too bad. Now, what is interesting, I think, about compost is you can either just chop it and leave it in the borders where it is, chop and drop. And so all your wood prunings and things like that can go in the border and they'll just do it naturally. Or you can cart it all over to your heaps and you can mix it with the green and the brown ratios, as they all say in the books. Or you can do what I do and just fling it on, leave it, and then get it out when it's nice. And this is, it looks like done compost, doesn't it? You know, it looks nice and brown and crumbly, just as it should be. But actually, this, when I put it on the beds, it will still go on breaking down for about 5 years or so. So things like banana skins that have gone in there, which are big protein molecules which aren't used by plants, too big, will go on slowly breaking down with the bacteria and the fungi in the soil. And so it's slowly giving off what the plant needs, the nitrogen, the phosphate and the potassium, over a longer period of time. So when it looks finished, it's not. It's still moving on, and it will probably go on moving on and breaking down for another 5 years or so. The other thing that I find interesting about compost is whenever you get it tested, the pH of it is always quite alkaline. It seems to me it's like pH 8 or something like that, which is quite alkaline, and that's due to the hydroxide ions apparently produced from the hydrogen that the bacteria produce from the hydrogen. If your soil is naturally acid and you put a load of alkaline compost in, it will slowly, over 2 years or so, go back to the soil's natural pH, but it will raise it initially. The other thing I don't put on here are weeds with seeds or flowers that look like they're going up to seed, because the heat in this will not kill them. So I will be re-spreading weed seeds onto my soil, which I really don't want. And so I just put those in a bucket of water and I leave them for months and months until they stink, and then I pour them somewhere when I keep an eye on them, just to make sure all the seeds are dead. Because I really don't like lots of weeds in my garden, because I just don't have the time to spend, days on my hands and knees hoiking them all out. But I do like my homemade compost. I certainly wouldn't want to get it taken away from the garden. It's not a long process. I tend to buy in or get in the cheap organic matter in a huge scale anyway, like the ray meal, which I get free from my tree surgeons. So this is just an added bit of niceness really to add on to my garden when I have a moment to spare. So I also put a bit of cow's poo in here, not stored, but they're just in the field. So when you get loads of poo in the field, or sheep's poo, I put a bit on, or I put it in a bucket of water, make a liquid feed and put it on my stuff in my greenhouse. Generally I never use well-rotted manure, because it's always got weed seeds in it, in my experience. However well rotted it is, you always get weeds on the outside of the pile that'll come in or whatever, and you just bring in bindweed, nettles, dock leaves, all things that I can live without in my borders. So to generally sum up, don't waste your money and pollute the streams and rivers by adding artificial fertilizers onto your garden. Just keep adding mulches annually. Anything you can get your hands on, maybe your homemade compost, maybe ray meal from tree surgeons, whatever you can get inexpensively. And that will keep the soil pretty healthy. It will give you good crops. And in my garden for 30 plus years, it's had no artificials and it's produced me wonderful yields. And I think it's better for the soil, and we really need to look after our soil.